Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this video on pawn structures in the middle game. So this video is the third in a series. I've collected these together in a middle game playlist. The first one was Introduction to the Middle Game, the second one was Peace Play in the Middle Game. This one is Pawn Structures, and then the last one will be about planning and strategy. And this is a little 4-game overview. And then I was going to follow this up with a video series on the top 10 middle game ideas, where I'll have lots of examples and stuff. So, well, let's get into this one. So we want to talk about pawn structures. Let's see. So let's start with a few definitions. So the common definitions, these are, you probably know these, but a rank is a horizontal row of the chessboard. The ranks are numbered from 1 to 8. And a file is a vertical column of the chessboard. The files are denoted A to H. And then an open file is a file that has no pawns on it. So that's where the pieces can come into direct conflict. A half-open file is a file with one pawn on it. For example, in a Sicilian, the C file is usually a half-open file because after the C pawn is traded for the D pawn, it just has the opponent's pawn on it. An isolated pawn is a pawn that has no pawns that are neighbors, no pawns that can support it of the same side. So if you look at the files next to an isolated pawn, both those files are going to be at least half open. Or, yeah, half open. There's just no pawns around to support it. A doubled pawn is a pawn where you have two pawns on the same file. And these pawns can be a bit clumsy. The pawn in front will sometimes obstruct the pawn behind, prevent it from advancing. And then a backwards pawn is a pawn which is restrained by an enemy pawn and not supported by a friendly pawn. So a backwards pawn has a hole in front of it, and that's covered by an enemy pawn, and it typically is supporting a friendly pawn. So there's a forward pawn in a backward pawn pair. So I'll give an example of that. That was kind of obscure, the way I phrased that. Anyway, let's go on to Rubin Fine's guidelines. So like in the previous video on Peace Play, I started with what Rubin Fine's recommendations were on the middle game. And now notice he had 7 recommendations for Peace Play, but only 1 for pawn structures. And, that's probably accurate. It's a book for people learning how to play chess, and really Peace Play is most important. But pawn structures do play a role, so there's more to say about them than the simple avoid doubled, isolated, and backwards pawns. In fact, I would say that's often wrong, that statement. So it reminds me, I was in a conversation not too long ago with some strong players, masters and strong experts, and one of them was saying that you carry around this rule book in your head. You've learned all these rules from your teachers, from your reading, from your own experience, and you sort of compiled this list of rules of things to do in chess. And at some point to improve, you really have to take about a third of those rules and either throw them away or completely rewrite them. And that's I think, a true statement. You have to improve your chess knowledge, and sometimes that involves getting rid of things you thought you knew. And this is one of those things that you have to, this is a good candidate for a rule that needs rewriting. So, the way I would look at this is you need to understand what's going on with these doubled, isolated, or backwards pawns. They have weaknesses, but they have potential strengths. They have dynamic possibilities. And there are different ways to approach this. So just learning how to play positions with these kind of pawn structures is important. So let's go on to some examples, starting with the doubled pawns. So, well, first of all, the commentary on the doubled pawns. They're weak because they can be difficult to defend. For example, the pawn in front of a doubled pawn pair can't be defended by a rook from behind. So that can come under attack and may be hard to defend. Also, the pawn behind the forward pawn, that can be difficult to defend because usually its neighboring pawns aren't around to support it, so it has to be defended by a piece. So both of them are weak. Whether you attack one or the other depends on the situation. Doubled pawns are not very mobile because particularly the backwards pawn in this doubled pawn pair, it runs into the pawn in front of it, so it can't move easily. And a doubled rook pawn is especially bad. You will often see, for For example, if someone places their knight on h6, that'll be black. If black puts his knight on h6, white will just snap that knight off, even if it means giving up the bishop pair, because when you take back with the pawn, you ended up with these doubled rook pawns on the h file. And you know, a rook pawn in general is not worth as much as other pawns, as I mentioned in the previous video, and have two of them is doubly bad. So that's pretty solid. But there are good things about doubled pawns, particularly if the doubled pawns are near the center. One thing is, if you have doubled pawns, you're guaranteed to have at least a half-open file, because that pawn had to come from somewhere, and whatever file it left is now half open at least. Doubled pawns can control squares, and like I said, if they're near the center, these can be important central squares. And there are dynamic possibilities for the forward pawn in a doubled pawn pair. If you got two pawns, the one in front can sometimes move forward, maybe even sacrificing itself, but messing up the opponent's position. So here, let's take a look at an example. And I choose just a mainline opening. Actually, I'm doing this for all the examples. I'm showing these positions arising in mainline openings. This is to reinforce the point that players don't avoid those structures. They just play them with a certain understanding. So this is the Ruy Lopez with the move bishop to b5 here, attacking the knight. And a6 is the most common response, the Morphy defense. And now bishop to a4, retreating, is the main line, but bishop to c6 is bishop takes c6 is a playable line known as the exchange variation, and black takes back. So now black has one of these so-called bad pawn structures, right? He's got the isolated pawns, but you notice he's not following Rubin Fine's rules. He's not avoiding those structures. He's understanding them, and he's understanding the strengths and weaknesses that come with them. So one thing that black got out of that exchange is black got the bishop pair. He has two pairs of bishops, and white only has one. He has two bishops and white has one. He doesn't have two pairs. Also, he has open lines for those bishops. This exchange has opened up some lines. And in particular here, you can see the open file that you get. And in fact, this open file is already a source of counterplay for black. So if white tries to grab this pawn, you have the move queen to d4 here, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn, and getting the pawn back. So this pawn is not really loose here. And these pawns, the doubled pawns over here, control important squares in the center. In fact, this structure over here on the queen side is pretty solidly defended. A lot of times black will choose to castle queenside and just sit behind these extra pawns over here and feel pretty safe. Also, in other ways, there are other ways to play this, and one idea is just to push this pawn forward and maybe disrupt white's pawn structure if white is played quietly with a move like d3 rather. Of course, the best way for white to play is to play more actively. White got a slight lead in development here, so castling and playing d4 here is the main way for white to continue. Okay, so that's pros and cons of the doubled pawn, and it also shows how modern players don't avoid those at all. This is just a mainline opening, and the black is not afraid of taking on the doubled pawns, and white doesn't gain a whole lot by dishing those out. Let's talk about backward pawns next. Backward pawn is a weak pawn once again. It can, I probably shouldn't have scrolled up. It can be attacked, and there are no pawns around to defend it, so it has to be defended by pieces. Also, the square in front of a backward pawn is a good outpost for the opponent. He can sink a piece there, and it can't be chased away. The positive aspects of the backward pawn is it's doing a useful job in a lot of cases. It's defending this pawn that was moved forward in advance, and it may have some dynamic possibility. Sometimes you can push that backwards pawn forward just and dissolve that, get something out of it. So let's take a look at that position. A position with a backwards pawn. This is the Sicilian Najdorf, and once again there's a mainline opening. e4, c5, that's the Sicilian, knight c3, d6, d4. The open Sicilian is the main line. We now have some half-open files here. Cancel that. Knight f6 is the main move here, attacking the pawn. Knight c3, and now a6. That's a characteristic move of the knight, or if it controls this b5 square, which stops the bishop coming to b5 and stops the knight coming to b5. And bishop to e2. This is not the most popular choice these days, but it's one of the top 3 moves, and a very solid way for white to play. Black will often answer e5. Now e6 is also a possible move there, just going halfway. But e5 is still a main line here. The knight drops back to b3. And now this is the backwards pawn. It's restrained by the enemy pawn, and it has no pawns that can support it, so it's a weakness. White can pile up on that, and white can take a look at this hole, the hole in front of the backwards pawn, and think about putting a piece there. So that gives some clear strategic ideas for white. But why did black play this way? Black is happily going into this position. For one thing, he did get a tempo. He got this pawn forward with one move, and he kicked a knight back. Kicked the knight out of the center. He also opened up a diagonal for his light squared bishop. So he's got a little bit of space. He'll be able to place his pieces. And it just turns out in this position it's pretty difficult for white to really exploit this backwards pawn. So let's continue for a few moves. Black can continue with e6. And one point is that if white immediately tries to sink a piece there, take advantage of that nice-looking square, it can be traded. And now in this particular case, because the bishop is protecting that square, you have to take back with the pawn. You can't take with the queen here. And, well, then now the bishop has to move, so it just drops back. But this position is pretty comfortable for black. His one weakness here, the backwards pawn, is now no longer backwards. It's been shielded. It's shielded by this white pawn, so it's no longer considered a backwards pawn. If you attacked it from the side somehow, then you would still need a piece to defend it. So it's still a bit of a weakness, but it's not as weak as it was before. And yeah, black can think of expanding on the king side here. He's actually got a majority of pawns over here. So this is okay. And another idea in this position for black after bishop e6, if white just castles, say, and doesn't put a piece there, then you can think about pushing this pawn forward. This is the dynamic possibility of the backwards pawn. If it's not stopped, maybe it can come forward and dissolve itself. Now in this case, I'm not sure this is so good, because it looks like after some trades, looks like white has a lead in development. But black has some compensation in the form of the only center pawn in the position. So this is probably playable for black. And anyway, it's an idea in some cases to push that pawn forward, so it's just something to keep in mind. So overall, that's the point about this particular backwards pawn. It's just not so easy for white to exploit. I guess what white should try to do in this situation is build up pressure along the d-file until it's safe to put a piece there, and white can recapture with a piece to maintain this pawn as a backwards pawn. These pawn weaknesses, let's go back to this list, they do become an issue more in the endgame. So you usually want to do something dynamic in the middle game to either dissolve the weakness or take advantage of it and create some weaknesses on your opponent's side as well. So the third kind of bad pawn was the isolated pawn. And an isolated pawn is weak. It doesn't have pawns on either side to defend it, so if it's attacked by a piece, it has to move or be defended by a piece. The square in front of an isolated pawn is also a good outpost for the opponent. But there are positive aspects for the isolated pawn, particularly if it's centrally located again. It provides for two files, one on each side, that are at least half open. It can control key central squares, and it has some dynamic possibilities. If it can be pushed forward, it can open up the position in a favorable way. So here, let's look at a typical opening with an isolated queen's pawn. This is the Nimzo-Indian. So d4, knight f6. We're going to look at the Rubinstein variation, c4, e6, knight c3, now bishop b4. That's the Nimzo-Indian. e3 is the Rubinstein variation. And black castles, bishop d3. It's a very common line here in d5. Certainly there are other ways to play. I'm just going for a particular line that results in the isolated queen's pawn. Knight of 3, c5. Black puts all the pawns in the center and tries to maximize the tension, I guess. Castles, takes, d takes c4. Now cancel that, takes the other way. D takes c4, bishop takes, and then takes on d4. And white voluntarily takes back with the pawn. So white is not, once again, avoiding the isolated pawn. He's actually, he could take with the knight and avoid it. And the better move here is to take with the pawn. It gives white a little more control over the center, more space. He's got good development. Black's bishop is a little bit hemmed in by this pawn. This isolated queen's pawn acts as a restraint on this d pawn. So it's doing a good job here, and this is a position that white players are happy to play. Now the play from here could proceed. Let's see, there's open files, so putting your rooks on open files makes sense. Maybe developing this bishop out of the way first. And black, on the other hand, is going to try and restrain this pawn. Let's erase those arrows from white. And black is going to maybe try and get a rook on this file, looking at the pawn, maybe sink a piece here. Putting a piece there right now I don't believe works out particularly well. No, it may be possible. Actually, I don't know if white wants to trade, so maybe the knight could immediately go to d4. But you may want to work up to it with some moves like knight here to here, and then you can put a knight on there pretty securely. And then in the long run try and trade off pieces and go into an endgame where eventually this pawn will become a weakness. And white tries to play dynamically and prove that he's got a good attack going. And he has a lot of open lines and bishops that can be pointed at the king side pretty quickly. So anyway, interesting position and good play for white here. And another idea is to push this pawn forward in some circumstances. When you push this pawn forward, imagine if there were a bishop on this diagonal, it would open up the diagonal, and it also would open up a square for a knight to jump into, which can often be a good square for white's pieces. So pushing forward the isolated pawn, often after a certain amount of build-up, if you have a chance to push that forward, it's not just to dissolve it. You may do that in order to dissolve the weakness, but you can also do it because it activates all your pieces. They can just come to life at a certain point. Okay, so that's it for the isolated queen's pawn and isolated pawns in general. So let's talk about more general structures. I was talking about very specific situations, but there's it's common to talk about positions in general in the chessboard. Positions are classified as either open or closed, and it's not a hard and fast line, but it's kind of a continuum. So the game starts off as a completely closed position because there's pawns on all the files, and as half-open files and open files get created, the position opens up. So an open position has some open lines in the center, I think is the technical definition. Some completely open files in the center is an open position. But there are all these stages in between where there's some half-open files. There's a terminology used about openings. So some openings are classified as open games, some as semi-open games, and some as closed games. I just wanted to mention this. The difference between an open game and a closed game is most often, the game starts out closed and opens up. So even those closed games will turn into open games at some point. So the difference really is how quickly the position opens up. So the open games are games that start with the moves e4, e5. And most of those will open up pretty quickly, although there are exceptions. And in fact, I'm going to use the closed Ruy Lopez as an example, because the main line of a Ruy Lopez is a closed position that stays closed for quite a while. Semi-open games are games like the Sicilian, where you have some half-open files fairly early on, and then a long period of maneuvering before it opens up further. And then there are closed games. Usually the d4, d5 openings are classified as closed games because often you have entirely closed positions for quite a while. So closed positions lend themselves to piece maneuvers, but keep in mind that these piece maneuvers are most often preparing in some way or another for the opening of the position. If you get your pieces into the right spots, then when it opens up, you're prepared to flood forward into your opponent's camp and win the game. And sometimes positions will open up violently with a piece sacrifice. Sometimes they open up with a pawn trade. It all depends on how big an advantage you've managed to accumulate. But never forget the idea of sacrificing a piece to open up a completely closed position after you've gotten your pieces and pawns arranged the way you like, to best take advantage of that opening. If you can catch your opponent's pieces offside, basically, you can get away with sacrificing a piece because your remaining pieces will get to the key squares quicker than your opponent's. So let's take a look at that closed position I was talking about. This is from the Ruy-Lopez. This is the main line of the Ruy-Lopez, e4, e5. Knight f3, knight c6. Bishop b5, that's the characteristic move of the Ruy-Lopez. a6, the Morphy defense, and now the main line goes bishop a4, not taking. And now knight f6, attacking the center, castling, sort of ignoring the attack on the center, but it's a little bit... there are ways to get the pawn back after black grabs that pawn. So bishop to e7, black ignores that. Rook e1, defending now. b5, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back. So eliminating this idea of exchanging against the knight. Now d6, supporting the center. c3, preparing to build up a big center. Black castles. h3, preventing the bishop from coming out and pinning. This knight comes to a5, harassing the bishop. Bishop drops back. And the idea of this knight maneuver is to allow this pawn to come forward so black gets a little more center influence. White goes d4. Now queen c7, also shoring up the center. Knight bd2. And bishop to d7. Knight to f1. So now this knight maneuver starts. The knight goes from here to either g3 or e3. And a very common theme in the closed Ruy-Lopez. Now this position is not completely closed. Here, I'll play on a few more moves. Knight f1, rook f to e8, and knight to e3. That's actually one of the main lines in the Ruy-Lopez coming back towards the center. But it's also looking out at the king side as well as the center. So this knight maneuver has got another piece from the queen side over to the king side. So this can be preparing for an assault. So that's one thing you can do with your piece maneuvers. What I wanted to say about this center is that this is a closed position, but it's not static. It could still open up. Black can open it up by taking, or white can take, or white can push on with d5 and try and keep it closed, depending on what he wants to do. So this is a fluid structure in the center, and I'll come back to that point. Now let's look at this. So that was a closed position with piece maneuvers. Open positions, on the other hand, if you've got open lines, that often leads to exchanges. For example, two rooks fighting for an open file, and also leads to tactics. So as the position opens up, more and more tactical possibilities tend to appear as those pieces come into contact. So that's one dichotomy, closed versus open. Another way of looking at pawn structures is to whether they are symmetrical or asymmetrical. So a symmetrical pawn structure is that the pawns from both sides are all in the same files. And openings that have a symmetric pawn structure, result in a symmetric pawn structure, are considered pretty drawish. And but the advantage of the first move can persist in some of these somewhat drawish positions. So let's give an example. This position is the exchange Slav. So d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, c6, Slav defense, and now c takes. And this leads to a symmetric position. White is taking this pawn when black has to take back with the pawn. I guess you could consider taking with the queen, but it'll lose some time to knight attacks. So another example where black doesn't want to give white an isolated pawn. I'm sorry, that's wrong. It wouldn't be isolated anyway because this pawn would support it. Anyway, yeah, so it makes more sense for black to try and keep a pawn in the center. White continues knight c3, knight f6, knight f3. This is just a typical development. It's probably one of the main lines. Bishop f4, bishop f5, e3, e6. So we've gotten to this position that I wanted to talk about. And this is actually completely symmetrical. The pieces are symmetrically arranged as well as the pawns. But what I meant by symmetrical pawn structures is every pawn has an opposing pawn in the same file. So that's a symmetrical pawn structure. What it does is it leaves only completely open files. There's no half open files in this position. They're all full open or closed. And the one open file is the C file. And the reason this is considered to be somewhat drawish is that both sides are going to place their rooks on the C file and exchange off, and it'll be hard for either side to make a huge advantage. But keep in mind that white still has the first move in a position where you've reached a symmetric setup. It's going to be white's turn to move because he has that first move advantage, and he's kept it. And so white can play an interesting move like queen b3, hitting this loose pawn here. And now if black defends with a symmetric move, white can exchange and create a isolated doubled pawn, which is a bit weak, and that's a good position for white. So that's actually black in this position, instead of moving the queen out, plays this move bishop to b4, blocking the view of the queen to the pawn. And you can see it starts to get a little bit sharp there. But white maintains some slight pull, even though this position is considered drawish. Definitely white players play this to win. And it's well suited to a player who doesn't want to take a lot of chances, because these symmetric positions it's very difficult for black to try and to really get anything going. It's easier for black to get some counterplay going in an asymmetric position. So if white wants to play for just a slight edge and not giving his opponent any counterplay, often going for these symmetric structures like the exchange Slav, the exchange French is another one. That can be a way to play. Okay, so asymmetric structures, on the other hand, lead to unbalanced positions, and also because there's no completely open file, the pieces tend to stay on the board longer. I should say if there's no completely open file. So if you start with just a couple of half-open files, then there's no fully open file. You've got an asymmetric structure, and the pieces will last a bit longer. It leads to more complicated games, more complicated middle games. And asymmetric structures create pawn majorities and minorities. So let's take a look at this. Next example. This is a classical Sicilian. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and d4, going for the open Sicilian. Takes, and knight f6, attacking the e-pawn, and knight c3 defending. And now a6 was the Najdorf. There's the classical Sicilian is knight c6. I just wanted to put this position on the board. And to take a look at the pawn structure here, both sides have a half-open file, so it's pretty logical for black to play for some activity with his rook on the C file, and white could consider bringing a rook over to the D file and trying to get some activity going here. There's also majorities and minorities. So black has 5 pawns over here on the king side, and white only has 4 pawns. Whereas on the queen side, here black has 2 pawns and white has 3 pawns. So these 2 pawns over here, these 2 pawns that black has, this is a minority, again facing 3 pawns. And these 4 pawns over here, this is a minority as well, facing this majority. So minorities against majorities are a pretty interesting theme for the middle game. Sometimes when you have a majority of pawns, you just push forward and try and take advantage of it. That's pretty common. But it's also common to push forward the minority of pawns. So for example, one idea from this position is for white to castle to the queen side and push these king side pawns forward, going for an attack. And black does the symmetric thing. He castles king side and pushes his queen side majority forward. So we have opposing pawn storms, and both sides are using a minority of pawns to attack a majority. Okay, let's see. I had one more example while we were talking about symmetric and asymmetric positions. This is a position known as the Carlsbad structure. This comes from the Queen's Gambit declined again. So d4, d5, c4, c6, the Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6. So this is a semi-Slav. This pawn triangle is the semi-Slav. And white can take here, and black can take back either way at this point. But the most common way of taking is going for an asymmetric structure like this. And then after a couple more moves, say bishop g5 to get the bishop outside the pawn chain, knight bd7, and e3, we get this kind of structure. And this is known as the Carlsbad structure. So there's these 3 pawns that white has. White has an extra pawn in the center, so white has a little more center influence. Black has these 3 pawns. And this used to be thought that this position was good for white, because white has an idea known as the minority attack, where he just pushes these pawns forward. And if you can imagine, if these 2 pawns, and let's erase some of these colors here, if these 2 pawns got traded off against these 2 pawns, then black would be left with a backwards pawn. And so that idea, that's just one way it could happen, but in general, it turns out that you can push these pawns forward, provoke some trades, and the remaining structure over here on black's queen side is going to be kind of weak. So it's a very simple plan, but on the other hand, it's kind of slow. It takes a while to get those pawns down there. And when black took back this way, he's opened up this diagonal for his light squared bishop. So black can get quick counterplay by attacking the king side here. So it's no longer thought that the minority attack is such an overwhelming thing that black should avoid it. And in fact, both sides are happy to play this position. Of course, white can defend against that attack with proper play and still go for this minority attack. So it's just a counterbalance. White's attacking on the queen side and black is attacking on the king side. Interesting play in star. Okay, so let's go back to the list. So that's examples of asymmetric structures. Let's talk a little bit about fixed versus fluid pawn structures. So these pawn structures are fluid when the pawns can move. And let's go back. Well, okay, I'll go back to the example in a bit. So sometimes it's recommended that you want to maintain the tension. Maintaining the tension is an interesting idea, something you should always consider. What that means is you leave the pawns in a position where exchanges are possible, but you don't complete those exchanges. You just let them sit there. And they can be difficult to play, though, because it makes demands on your ability to calculate. Every move, you have to think, what's going to happen if he takes a pawn? Is this a position where I should take the pawn? And, of course, your opponent has to consider those things as well. And if you can learn how to play with that tension, it can be a very effective weapon. It can make the position complicated, use up your opponent's time, get him into some time pressure there, or just kind of overburden him with complications. So it's a way to play for a win just by making things complicated. Fixed structures, on the other hand, they don't have that flexibility, but they provide some clarity. It may make your calculations easier to have some clarity, but these fixed structures can also become targets. So here, let's go back and look at a few examples. I wanted to go back to that Ruy Lopez example, because that's a good example of a fluid structure. There's so many things going on here. This pawn can be taken this way, this pawn can be taken this way, and black can take this way, and black can take this way. And there's the other option of just pushing forward. So this is a very fluid pawn structure, even though it's a closed position. Let's go forward to the fixed structure I wanted to look at. This is an example from the French defense. e4, e6, a very classic way to get into a fixed pawn structure. d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6 is the classical French. e5. Now we've set up a fixed pawn structure. These two pawns are not going anywhere, and they're opposed by two pawns that are also not going anywhere. But the play continues. Let's go forward a few moves. f4 to round up. What I wanted to point out is that black very quickly goes about undermining these pawns. So these fixed pawns become targets. They can't move forward. So they're just sitting ducks, as it were, and they just have to suffer the consequences of these other pawns coming forward and attacking them. Now in this case, this is still okay. It's not like anything awful has happened. This is a perfectly fine opening for both sides. Let's see, bishop e3, just defending it. But you see this pawn does have to be defended by pieces, mainly because this knight's in the way. Sometimes, another idea or way to play this is to move the knight out of the way and bring the c-pawn forward to defend that way. But this particular line you defend with pieces. C takes, knight takes, and bishop to c5, putting pressure on this knight. So that's as far as I wanted to go. We see that this fixed pawn structure came under attack. After some trades, notice that this space opened up and white was able to place a piece there. And this is actually a pretty good piece on the center of the board, and black is immediately trying to put pressure on it. And that was also the reason for this move, f4, was to continue to support this forward pawn. So the fixed structure didn't last for all that long, and that's commonly the case. And now these two pawns are fixed at the moment, but black may also at some point play this move f6 and try and further undermine this pawn structure. So even the term fixed versus fluid, a fixed pawn structure does not have indefinite duration. Usually as the game progresses, one side will it is true that you can sometimes just work around a fixed pawn structure and it will never change throughout most of the game, but a lot of times the play is about undermining that fixed structure. So just because a structure is fixed, you can't assume that it's going to last forever. That's the point I wanted to make. Okay, so let's go on. Last topic here I wanted to get into is pawn breaks. So when you have a closed position, it is going to open up at some point, and the way it opens up is often with a pawn break. So what is a pawn break? A pawn break is a pawn move that you have that attacks a pawn which is fixed. So if there's a pawn that's fixed, can't move forward, and you attack it with another pawn, then that opens up the possibility of an exchange. And in fact, if you're determined on exchanging, there's no way your opponent can prevent it. That's why these pawn breaks can be very powerful. So you can force an opening in the position with a pawn break. So let's give one more example. The next position I wanted to look at was, the check Benoni. This opening is not so popular. I would say most of the openings I've shown you so far are really quite popular and often played. This one is not played so much, but it's interesting from the point of view of pawn breaks. So d4, knight f6, c4, c5. This is a Benoni. Black places a pawn on c5, attacks the center, and encourages this pawn to come forward. White plays the d5. And now the modern Benoni is the move e6, a more common way to play these days. But e5 here is the check Benoni, just going right past that pawn. And after a few more moves, say knight to c3, d6, e4, these are actually the main moves, bishop e7, we get a structure in the center which is completely fixed. And it's even hard to see, maybe it's not that hard to see, but you can see this pawn, actually the most advanced pawn can't be undermined at all. There's no way other pawns can attack it, but these pawns can be undermined, these two pawns, the c pawn and the e pawn. So black has two pawn breaks in this position. His pawn breaks are the moves b5, going after the c pawn, and the move f5, going after the e pawn. So that's a good example of pawn breaks. So we're going to have a closed position. Neither of those moves can be played right now. Well, not successfully, right? This would just lose a pawn. So black goes through a long period of maneuvering here, where he attempts to set up one of those pawn breaks. Set up a pawn break on one side or the other. And if you like a closed maneuvering game, it's a kind of an interesting position from that perspective. And players who play this kind of opening, although it's not that popular, it can be tough to defeat, because they can maneuver their pieces around and then strike with these pawn breaks at the critical moment. If you look at this position with the chess engine will say that white's much better, but your advantage is strictly in space, and how you convert that to a victory is sometimes a tricky thing to determine. Of course, white has pawn breaks too. White has it's a symmetric structure, so white has the same pawn breaks. He has b4 and f4. He can attack the c pawn and the e pawn. So white can play for those pawn breaks as well, and it's kind of an interesting game there. So let's wrap it up here. So what is my advice? So keep in mind, before I get into my advice, I kind of started this video out with the story about how you have to rewrite your rule book at certain points. So now I'm going to fill your head with rules. So keep in mind you're going to have to rewrite these rules at some point if you want to advance. But these should do for now. My first point of advice is you should really learn how to play open positions. Any closed position will eventually open up, turn into an open position. So you got to really feel comfortable playing those open positions to get good at chess. And then after that, you can start to learn the closed positions and the semi-open positions. The second point is, we've talked about weaknesses. The way to take advantage of these pawn weaknesses is to fix them, to prevent those pawns from moving forward and then come under attack. So these pawn structures, the reason they're so interesting from a middle game perspective is they give rise to plans, and this is an example of a middle game plan. And then there's the counterpoint to that, which is you're going to have weak pawns as well. It's not all going to be one-sided. And for your weak pawns, you want to try and maintain dynamic possibilities. You don't want to allow your opponent to fix those pawns. So you want to try to keep open the option of pushing them forward. And then lastly, in a closed position, don't allow it to be completely closed. Try and preserve some pawn breaks for yourself, and also try to eliminate your opponent's pawn breaks. So if you see your opponent, for example, in that last case, he wants to get in the move b5 to hit your c pawn, you can throw your a pawn forward. So your pawn on a4 and your pawn on c4 are both clamping down on that b5 move. And so that's trying to eliminate your opponent's pawn breaks. And the advantage, if you can achieve this, if you can get rid of your opponent's pawn breaks, prevent them, and still have some pawn breaks yourself, then you're free to maneuver and play that pawn break at the right moment, whereas your opponent really will lack a plan, an effective plan at that point. Okay, so that leads into the next video, which is going to be about planning and strategy in the middle game. Stay tuned for that one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I was wrapping up one moment too soon. I had one more example I wanted to show you. So this is just a little bit of a test to see what you've learned from this video. See if you can think of about a position independently. This is from the modern Benoni. This is a mainline position. It is black's turn to move here, but I don't think that's relevant. I just want to be accurate. What I want you to do is to look at this position and see what you can tell about the pawn structure just from looking at it. Identify those open, half-open files, weak pawns, strong pawns. And so pause the video here and think about it for a while and see how many features of the position you can identify, and see if you can come up with a plan for black and a plan for white. Okay, I was just pausing there to give you time to pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and talk about this position myself. So first of all, the half-open files here are the E file for black and the C file for white. So those are natural files to put your rooks on. Black is probably going to castle kingside here, and fianchetto his bishop. It's already set up for the bishop. And these pawns on dark squares. Here, let's erase that. Erase that bad arrow. Yeah, the bishop here on g7, looking out at this diagonal, looks like a good piece, aided by these pawns. So that's a thematic idea for black in this position. And white has some good spots for his pieces as well. From white's point of view, this pawn looks like a weakness. Now this, if you thought this was a backwards pawn, technically it's not. This pawn is protected from the front, or shielded from the front, by the presence of a d-pawn. So I wouldn't classify that as a backwards pawn. But it is still a weakness because it can be attacked from this diagonal. A lot of times the idea is to develop the bishop here to put pressure on that pawn. It has to be defended. And another piece that can attack that pawn is a knight placed on the c4 square can look at that pawn as well. So those are some ideas for white here. He's got a couple good squares for his pieces. He's got some pawn weaknesses to attack. Now, black can try and control that by pushing his queenside pawns forward. That's often an idea. And that also takes away the c4 square from this knight. White can play to slow down that attack with a move like a4. So those are some ideas. The second thing is majorities and minorities. So this is a situation where you want to attack with a majority of pawns, I think. So white has a majority here on the king side and in the center. And so it's often an idea just to push these pawns forward and try and expand on the king side or into the center and get an attack going that way. Whereas black has a majority over here on the queen side, and it's an idea for him just to gain space. And, you know, he can even get a pawn all the way forward to this square and just try and control this whole diagonal and maybe win some material over here on the queen side. All in all, a very unbalanced position. So this is a typical example of a semi-open position with the imbalances that you get. So I think that covers it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.